What do you think was Pakistan's single biggest strategic miscalculation in dealing with militancy?
Pakistani militant, I'm referring to the groups who were very close to Pakistan establishment once. The biggest mistake was made in 2019. It was Al-Qaeda, which was on the driving seat.
Pakistan's earlier distinction between the good Taliban and the bad Taliban created space for groups like TTP to emerge. The Haqqani network has historically acted as a bridge between the Afghan Taliban, Al-Qaeda and Pakistani militants.
2003 to 2006, and they created a network of associate globally.
Hello and welcome to New Wave History. Joining us today is Amir Rana, who is a leading security analyst, an expert on counterterrorism and militant dynamics. He's also a founding director of Pakistan Institute for Peace Studies. Assalamu alaikum, sir.
Wa alaikum salam. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, sir. We almost all of us keep on reading your articles in Dawn. Today we will majorly discuss TTP.
All right.
My first question to you is that many analysts describe the TTP as a classic case of blowback after Pakistan joined the war on terror, but others argue that it was an organic evolution of pre-existing jihad networks. In your view, was the emergence of TTP in 2007 an unintended consequence of state policy or the natural consolidation of militant ecosystems that had been developing since the Afghan jihad?
Yeah, I think this is very important to distinction that what is the militant ecosystem still exists in the country and what was the state policy. Both are very interlinked. And this was a state which had nurtured all these groups. And first it was for Afghanistan, then in Kashmir. And these groups found the space to create more spaces for them. These spaces they created not only in the physical domain, but also they expanded their ideologies. And just 9/11, just a few months before 9/11, many of these groups were involved in other parts of the countries, from Mindanao to Central Asia, and in Europe, in Bosnia and Africa. So this was an opportunity. So this is mainly depend on the credentials of a militant group. And if it's ideological and ideological motivation is coming from the religion, so they keep expanding their boundaries. First, in ideological domain, usually the state which they want to use them as a proxy or for their political purposes. So they compromise and they overlooked what they are doing. So the TTP, primarily it was the tribal movement, but other groups were also joining this alliance. And these groups were like Harkat, even the factions of the Jash, and at the later stage we have saw a few members from the JUD. They also joined this alliance. So this was, it had become a magnet, and primarily it was Al-Qaeda which was on the driving seat, and using TTP to connect with other militant organizations.
So we'll come to the Al-Qaeda later, but first of all, I want to ask that a common but also a controversial claim is that Pakistan's earlier distinction between the good Taliban and the bad Taliban created space for groups like TTP to emerge. Critics also argue that Pakistan tolerated certain militant groups like Lashkar-e-Taiba and Jaish-e-Mohammed, which indirectly created the conditions for TTP to prosper. How fair is this claim historically? Or does it just oversimplify a far more complex situation?
Yeah, I think it's not as a complex as sometimes we conceive. And when we try to theorize the militant movements, so it was primarily, we can say, it was the state policy. And at one stage, it wasn't the creating distinction between good and bad. All militants were good. And it was later when the General Musharraf had faced a couple of attempts on his life. At the time, there was soul searching started. And they say maybe there's a few spoilers within these movements. Otherwise, they are good. But it took a lot of time for the state to completely overview its approach towards these groups. And I say that ideology is a more major motivation for all these groups, and usually states compromise, and they remain confined to their very simplistic narratives that they are good, they are bad. They keep bracketing them into different categories, but militants have a sole agenda for achieving their ideological purposes.
Moving on to the next question, which is that the TTP's leadership, from Baitullah Mehsud to Hakimullah Mehsud to Noor Wali Mehsud, has been deeply rooted in the Mehsud tribe of South Waziristan. To what extent is the TTP a product of Mehsud tribal dynamics rather than a purely ideological militancy, as you just said?
Yeah, I know one perspective. So we can say that it was rooted in the Mehsud tribe, but at the same time, there were the other tribes, they were engaged in the militancy. And Waziris, they were also in Bhitnis. And we saw the similar kind of the patterns in other tribal agencies at that time, and including Khyber, Bajor. Muhammad was a separate agency at that time. So they had different shades, but the Mehsuds had provided the leadership. And there was a reason that why they provided the leadership. It first that it was in 2004, I think.
Okay.
It's in 2004. The one major incident happened when the Mehsud had kidnapped two Chinese engineers. They were working on the Gomal dam. So this was one of the trigger, and they suddenly pop up on the scene. And before that, it was a Naik Muhammad and other groups, Mullah Nazir, and they were basically, and at that time, another a name which was quite significant, Mullah Abbas. These were the leaders who were leading. But if you try to simplify, we can say, of course, in 2006 and 7, the certain incidents happens which created the conducive environment for the Mehsud's militants to lead this movement.
Okay. In the start of your discussion, you mentioned Al Qaeda. I would like to ask that how central was Al Qaeda in transforming local insurgencies into a structured organizations like TTP? Because for a fact, it also took refuge in FATA.
Yeah, Al Qaeda was quite instrumental organizing the TTP, and at that time they had come up with the new global strategies, and it was evolving between 2003 to 2006, and they created a network of the associate globally, and they just remained behind the scene, and they provided their sport and other logistic helps, but primarily they encourage these groups to combine their strengths and to fight against the regimes against whom they were fighting at that time. The TTP were scattered, and the Pakistani militant, I'm referring to the groups who were very close to Pakistani establishment once, including Jaish, Harkat, Sipahi Sahaba, Lashkar Jhangvi, and they were not treated as the loyal militants within the Al Qaeda ranks. So the idea, the trigger to create umbrella organization, it came from this factor, and they say, okay, if we cannot create an organization which were the proxies of the state, and it may spoil our whole movement. And this was a time when they decided that leadership should be given to the local tribes and to bring all these militant organizations under his fold. So this was the factor and reasons behind that.
Okay. The Haqqani network has historically acted as a bridge between the Afghan Taliban, Al Qaeda, and Pakistani militants. It even mediated between the TTP and Islamabad. It is often described also as a connective tissue of militancy in the region. How would you assess its role in either stabilizing or strengthening TTP, especially in terms of cross border sanctuaries and negotiations?
Yeah, this is not as simple. Haqqanis had their sanctuaries in Waziristan, and where they had their religious institutions, they had their businesses, families were living there. And when this conflict started in this area, so of course their primary focus was to keep their stronghold intact in these areas. And this was historically they had links with all the Arabs, including Al Qaeda and all these kind of the groups. But basically, they were at that time there were five, I think, formations existed in Afghanistan, with Kandahar, then to Helmand. Then there was one formation called the Peshawar Shura. Peshawar Shura was really the combination of the different Pakistani, Afghan international groups. So this Peshawar Shura had close links with Haqqanis. And this Peshawar Shura was also linked with TTP. So it was a complex a militant landscape at that time. Formally, TTP wasn't part of the Peshawar Shura, but they were partner in their joint operations in Afghanistan. And you are right, the Haqqanis were bridging between different militant actors because it's always been difficult since the Afghan-Soviet War to create cohesion and the bond within these militant organizations. Primarily Al Qaeda, it was, of course, on a driving seat, but the Haqqanis, they facilitated all these networks, mainly this Miranshah Shura and Peshawar Shura.
Okay. If we compare Baitullah Mehsud, Hakimullah Mehsud, and Noor Wali Mehsud, do you see a shift in TTP from a reactive militant group to a more strategic and politically aware insurgency? Because TTP evolved from Baitullah Mehsud's centralized insurgency to fragmentation, and then reconsolidation under Noor Wali Mehsud, who unified the factions.
Yeah, it always remained a very immature kind of the insurgency. We can't say that it was a full scale or the full-fledged insurgency. And the reason is at that time they didn't had any separatist agenda or to create their Islamic Emirates. It's come very late. First, when they had waged this movement, so they had to focus first to assess the Afghan Taliban, Al Qaeda in their operations in Afghanistan, and second, to purify their social structure. So, if you will see that they had killed the criminals, the drug peddlers in their areas, and they created the parallel courts, the judicial system, enforce Sharia in their areas. So this was primarily their purpose. And it remained until the Fazullah was the head of the organization. And this is Noor Wali Mehsud, basically, who had developed his credential as a more tribal focused organization, primarily for reforms for Islamic Sharia, but gradually they uh, become an insurgency. But their life as an insurgent movement remain very short-lived. And again, this is more a terrorist organization which had lost its sanctuaries in Pakistan and trying to recapture. And Haqqanis also have interest because they can keep controlling or holding these areas unless they have their partners, and their primary focus is to revoke the FATA reforms or the status of these agencies to bring back again. Right now is their major focus.
Okay. My next question is that after the US withdrawal from Afghanistan in 2021, it had been reported that the TTP gained access to the sophisticated weaponry that the US left behind. My question is that how has this changed the nature of insurgency? Are we looking at a more decentralized guerrilla force or a more capable quasi almost military actor?
TTP is not a guerrilla force, and we cannot compare with TTP with the insurgents movement. Even we can't compare its activities, operations with the BLA and BLF in Balochistan.
Okay.
And the guerrilla tactics are very different. So they were trained in the terrorist operations, and they keep focusing, and we have seen little variation in their tactics. So the weapon, of course, it enhanced their operational capabilities. Now they can attack on the Pakistan security forces. They also use all these suicide bombing and other kind of the terrorist tactic they use. So yes, of course, this NATO left weapons enhance their operational profile.
I'm moving almost towards the end of this debate. Pakistan experimented with peace deals and Lashkars, peace committees, and later movements like Manzoor Pashtun highlighted grievances in former FATA. In hindsight, were local peace committees and negotiations with militants a strategic necessity or a policy failure that allowed TTP to regroup? And how do movements like PTM, Pashtun Tahaffuz movement, reflect the deeper societal consequences of those years?
Yeah, this is, I think we need to look at in a very different perspective. And this peace negotiation using stick and carrot policy, the Pakistan inherited from the British colonial masters.
Yeah.
And they had applied the similar approach, not only in this area, but in Balochistan and other parts of the subcontinent at time. And Pakistan thought it may be a good template, and many other states also use, mainly in Africa, the similar approach. But the major flaw in this approach was that the tribal society had transformed into a semi-urban structure, especially after their displacements. And many of the tribesmen, not all the agencies, this is we cannot apply all the agencies at time, but the waziris and mehsuds, so they were already going under the social and political transformation. So this is had added, and Pakistan used it, and Pakistan, this strategy hasn't been, we can say that it was a very successful strategy, because we just apply the template as the British applied, and we made a little innovation. And this is the same challenge the Pakistan is facing when they, so people say that mainly the tribal elders to go for the negotiation and the peace deal. So they have bitter memories that once we had applied the similar approach, and which haven't been successful.
Okay. So, sir, my last question to you is that looking back over 2 decades, what do you think was Pakistan's single biggest strategic miscalculation in dealing with militancy, and what lesson does it still refuse to learn?
Yeah, the biggest mistake was made in 2019 when Pakistan had declared the victory over the TTP and terrorism.
Okay.
Number of terrorist attacks were decreasing, and suddenly they come up with the approach that now we have give them another chance to come back in the mainstream and for rehabilitation. So this was a major mistake, and as I mentioned, these are ideologically motivated movements, and which somehow have connection with the global terrorist networks like Al Qaeda influences, or they got influence from IS. So it was a mistake, and we had seen that when once the Taliban in 2021 they had captured Kabul, and Pakistan thought maybe this is the best moment to execute this reconciliation approach. Once for all, we have eliminated this threat. And I think this was a major blunder rather than mistake.
Okay. Sir, thank you so much for shedding light on the historical roots of TTP with us today. It will be quite helpful for our audience.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you so much.